Welcome to Board Game Binge, the place where we bring you bite-sized, bingeable board game content from across the industry. I'm your host, James Staley, and in this episode, we're welcoming back Joe Slack, a professional board game designer and author of the #1 international best-selling book, The Board Game Designer's Guide. Today, we're going to go talk about Joe's newest book, The Board Game Designer's Guide, Careers in the Industry, which launched just this week. Joe, welcome to the Binge. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. James, how are you doing?
I am doing fantastic. I actually had a good chance to read this book. I do appreciate you sending me kind of a preview to read. It was an easy read, like all of your books, of course. And I thought, wow, what a great topic of discussion is just kind of get you on the binge and talk about it. So why don't we start off by explaining what is this book about and why did you write it?
Sure. This book is really talking about all the different jobs, roles, and careers that are available in the industry out there in the board game industry. Besides, the typical thing that people think about, which is, game designer or publisher. And the reason that the idea came to me really was a talk that I saw from Scott Gaita from Renegade Games. He did at Proto-TO. I only saw the recording. I wasn't there for the actual event. But that's what his whole talk was on. It was about, there's other things out there. And he talked about, graphic design and project management and all of the other things. And you hear everybody wanting to get in as a game designer. I thought, well, this would be a great topic to go and, interview and talk to a whole bunch of other people in the industry who are doing all these different roles, find out how they got into them, what qualifications they need, what they like about it, what advice they have for other people getting into it, that type of thing, and share with others who may not even know that these opportunities exist, and they can use their own skills and experience that they have, maybe from other industries, and apply them in the board game world.
And how many people did you interview? There was a lot of quotes in there. I was just trying to think of the total number of people that you interviewed for this.
Yeah, it was well over 40 people. It was quite a few, from publishers to rulebook writers to content creators to reviewers, graphic designers, just everybody across the spectrum.
What I thought was really cool was it's not like you're just saying, well, here's a quote or here's a topic or some notes and I attribute it to this person over here. You're actually almost showing little mini case studies, which I thought was awesome, right? Because I think from being a publisher myself, kind of reading through, it really helped me put myself in the shoes of other people, right? And kind of say, okay, yeah, I've been in that kind of situation. Oh, it's interesting how their take is on it. So now talking to that many people, especially with COVID, how long did this take you to put together?
The whole process took quite a while because it's reaching out to people to see if they're interested in it, getting them to answer the questions. Some people preferred to do it over more of like a form or an email. Some people shot a video. A couple people wanted to do an actual call. It does take a bit of time to go through all that, but I thought that would be the best method. Like I can talk about all these other roles in the industry, and I know a fair bit about different pieces, but I haven't necessarily done those roles, not every single one of them. So I thought it was very valuable to reach out to the people that had been doing it for quite a while and get their insights into it. That would be the best method. And like you said, putting together kind of like case studies. After I got all this information, it's like, how am I going to do this? Am I just going to use just like a little quote here or there, that type of thing? But it just kind of made sense to include some of their quotes and talk about some specific things that they felt were really valuable, like the things that they do in their role, the skills that they bring to the role, what other advice they have for somebody that wanted to get into the role, that kind of thing, and intertwine it with, my own experiences, other things that I've seen, and kind of just, make it a good narrative, a good story all the way through.
And so the number one, role, I guess, that most people think about is probably game designer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Followed by that, I would say is probably publisher, developers, maybe kind of in between there, where people, and that was a big learning for me when I got into the industry, is kind of the difference between, developer is actually a different role than the publisher, and is a different role than the designer. But there's so many roles. What was the biggest surprise for you? Like, what was the one where you thought it didn't even enter your mind as a potential, kind of offshoot in this industry?
Well, I would say going back a few years, something like a rulebook editor, a rulebook writer. That was one. I think it was Dustin Statz I heard on Board Game Design Lab a couple of years ago, and I was like, wow, people do that, like actual like rulebook creation. I'm like, well, it makes sense, because designers are so close to it and that kind of thing. That it helps to have somebody else that has that expertise, that knows about layouts and writing styles and explaining a game really well. So going back more in time, that was one that I didn't really know about. Thinking about more ones that are kind of newer, I hadn't really thought too much about project management and things like that, like how important it was. And it depends on the publisher, because some publishers are really small, like, one person, two, three, four people. They might not have all these different roles. They might not have game designers and game developers and everybody on their staff. But the one thing is, you really have to be comfortable learning a bunch of different things. I found out more and more. So even though you might be hired as, head of game development or project manager or whatnot, you're probably still going to have to, run things at the booth, at conventions. You might have to do play testing, do acquisitions, help out with finance, help out with the books, like whatever it takes when you're a very small company. Even though you might be hired for a certain role, there's a lot of other different things that you might have to be pulled into as well.
It's interesting when you talk about the rule book. My most recent game, Nutty Squirrels of the Oakwood Forest, I had a friend who reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'd love to, take a look at your rule book." And I kind of sent it to him more from a, "Hey, can you check over the grammar and make sure there's no glaring spelling mistakes and so forth in here?" Stephen Hill was his name. And I think it was my realization when he went through it that there is a difference between having people edit your rule book from a grammar standpoint and just making sure your words and everything are right, and actually edit it from is this actually explain the rules properly? Are people going to walk away and get this? Is there pieces that are missing? Can they be laid out differently? And when I was reading this in your book, it kind of reminded me of that. I'm like, wow, those are really kind of two very different things. Where from the outside looking in, you might just say, well, that's just a rule book editor, but that could actually be two distinct roles.
Yeah, for sure. And one person that I interviewed for it is a friend of mine, and he's a designer in Toronto as well, Jeff Fraser. He does not only the editing, but he does the whole rulebook layout and everything. So he has a background in journalism and technical writing, so he's really good at that style. But also he really knows graphic design and layout, how to set up examples, how to have a game flow through using consistent language, because you don't want to refer to something as a round and a turn, or refer to, when the doctor does this, and then also say something like the medical officer or something like that. Like those little terms, people are like, well, who's that kind of thing? Like you have to be so consistent, lay it right out, and make sure everything's completely clear right all the way through.
Yeah, I had a lot of that in our book. I had referred to branches as limbs interchangeably. And then I had I refer to things as broken branches. Then I refer them as broken leaf cards, and it's all over the map. But you get copy blind, right? I guess is the word, where if you read something over enough, your brain will actually do the corrections, and you're reading it and it looks correct, and it may not be correct. So your own mind can play tricks on you. So it's always good to kind of have that kind of third set of eyes or outside looking in to make sure everything is good and clean.
Absolutely.
One thing you really talked about was that what I found interesting was the idea of communication, right? And if you want to be a publisher, I think you specifically said you've got to be a great communicator. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I would say, yeah, not even just for a publisher, but almost in any role, communications is so important. If you're a publisher, you need to be able to communicate with all your artists and graphic designers, rulebook editor, designers, developers, sales team, everybody. They all have to be on the same page. You have to be able to give a clear vision of what you want to do with this game, and what everybody's expectations are, what your expectations are of them, and make sure that that's clear, deadlines, timelines, everything. But also, if you're a graphic designer, you have to know exactly, what's expected of you and what you expect of, the publisher who you're working with, designer, same thing. Almost anybody in the role, it's super critical that you're communicating and making sure that everybody's on the same page. You never want to get to a point where somebody's like, well, where's that thing that I asked for? Oh, well, you said, it's not that big a rush. Yeah, but I need it for today. Well, you didn't say specifically today, that type of thing. So you just have to make sure that, everybody is like on the same wavelength, and whatever platform you're using, whether it's, just through email, if you're using Slack or Trello or whatever tool you're using, so that everybody knows, everybody has access to that, and can make changes and recommendations and that type of thing, and knows, what you're working towards.
If you're going to be a publisher, Should you design or develop first, or does it matter?
Um, well, it just depends. I think I mean, a lot of people do start out designing a game and then decide that they want to self-publish. So they're a designer and then they become a publisher anyhow. Um, I think most publishers in some way have designed at least a game and have tried to do it that way, which is good because you know everything that goes into a game, and then you know the development work that's needed afterwards and working with other people, and then you're learning the publishing side, how to get the game out, how to market it, how to publish it, and work with manufacturers, work with everybody else. So I think it's probably a good idea if you're going to become a publisher to know what it's like as a designer, because then you can relate to designers a lot better. You won't have unreasonable expectations like, oh, we need to design a solo mode for this. Can you get that to us by the end of the week kind of thing? Like, to understand that it's going to need time to be developed and play tested and tested with other people. You can't just give somebody a few days to do something like that. So I think it always helps to understand that, and you're not always going to be able to be an expert in all areas or have tried everything. Like, you're not going to have necessarily done graphic design and art and rulebook editing and game design and everything. So you're not going to have everything there. But at least if you have some background in some of those areas, and try to fill the other needs with other people who are better than you at certain things. For example, if like having an art director, having somebody who's doing development while you focus on project management and sales or something like that. Like it's about going with your strengths and having other smart people there with you who know those other things, so you don't, or you're not as good at.
What I thought was interesting about the comments on the developer is really it's about budget and schedule. I think is what you say in your book. Or as one of the people you interviewed said that that's kind of the key role of, if you're a developer on a team and that's your specific role, the designer, their job's to create a great game, right? And then if you're the publisher, you're the one that's going to basically fund it and kind of get it on the shelves. But that in between part is so critical of making sure that it's going to be economical, right? So you get it on budget,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to deliver your timelines. And I think you even talk about this with your recent solo game you did, where you gave an example of adjusting, I think, the blocks, the number of cubes, and how you're putting that in your box to get the cost down, because you got the great design, but then when it comes to the practicality of getting it to market, that's a whole different skill set that you got to consider.
Yeah, game development is really underrated, and not every creator, not every publisher uses a separate game developer. Sometimes, if they signed a game with a designer and they need some changes made and that kind of thing, they go through the designer and just ask them to make those changes, play test it, get it work there, because essentially they don't have to pay that person. They're already signed on and are going to get the royalties and everything, and they want to make it the best game possible and that type of thing. But the role of a game developer is really, a step aside from the game designer, and it's really a critical role, because what they're doing is they're taking what is a good or a great game and turning it into a great product. They're finding out all those little edge cases and looking at the components and looking at all the cards, looking at all the aspects and saying, is this needed? Is this necessary? Why is this here? Could we do this double-sided? Areas where you can possibly bring the cost down, especially if a publisher has in mind our games are always in the $30 to $40 range, and well, right now it's going to be at 45 to 50. Well, how can we get it down to that? So places where you can trim, but without damaging the quality of the game, obviously. The example that you were mentioning, Relics of Rajvihara, my game, I had 52 1-inch wooden blocks that were going to be screen printed, and in addition to cards and other components and stuff, it was going to be pretty expensive to be made. And I looked at it and I put on my own development hat on my own game and said, okay, how can I reduce this but still have a fantastic game that's, I don't want the game to be any less than it is now. And I found ways to cut out 14 blocks, and I got it down to 38, which was a considerable change. It reduces also the weight of the game, the amount of box size I need, and the cost for production. And it was able to actually make the game as good, if not a little bit better, because I was constrained. And that's something you have to do as a developer, and even as a designer sometimes, is constrain yourself and say, how can I make this an 18 card game without using anything else? How can I reduce the number of components and have it all fit in this box or whatever? And that's going to help it to make it a better product, because it's going to be a better cost, a better price point for your consumers. So instead of being a $50 game that they might be like, oh, I'm not sure. If you can bring it down to a $40 game, then be like, yeah, that seems about good perceived value for it. So that's part of the development work as well.
Yeah, I had encountered that on the Night Scrolls of the Oakwood Forest game as well, where I'm my own developer, right? So I'm the publisher. I'm also the developer. In this case, I was the designer as well, co-design with my brother. And I almost kind of had the different hats, right? So I had the first hat, which was the game designer. So I had made it with these minis, and I had the 3D models and everything done, and I kind of just made this like the biggest possible game I could. And then when it's done, that I'm like, okay, now it's time to start figuring out the manufacturing on this. I had to kind of take that hat off and put on the developer hat, and it's like, ooh, this isn't going to work. This is going to be way more complicated than it needs to be. If I cut the minis, is that going to impact the gameplay? Not really. So I had to make some tough decisions like that, and we end up, shifting some things over to be more digital. So, if somebody wants to print their own minis, they can, but the general population will be fine with meeples, right? For instance. So it's kind of making those tough decisions and being willing to kind of cut your favorite scene. I think it's George Lucas that was once quoted as saying that, is it a good director is a director that's willing to cut their favorite scene, right, for the sake of pacing it in a movie and so forth. So what would you say makes a good project manager?
Well, a good project manager really needs to, the main thing is be able to deliver on time and on budget. So they're given a timeline for when this game needs to be released, for example, and that the cost for manufacturing must be within this range. And they might be given both. It might just be a matter of, okay, we already have the game pretty much developed. We know what's going on. We need to get it out by this time. So they need to be able to coordinate with a bunch of other people, which is not always easy, because you've got a lot of freelancers. That's the other thing you really have to understand about the industry, is there's so many people working freelance. So you're going to be working with graphic designer, one or more artists, possibly a rule book writer, a game developer, sales, communications, social media, doing all that stuff. And some of those people might be in-house, but a lot of them are going to be outside of that. So you're relying on them delivering on those timelines when they have other projects with other publishers and other companies that they're working with as well. So being able to communicate timelines, making sure everything's done well, and being able to put those buffers in and know where the bottlenecks might come in, and be able to continue to move forward. So it's really all about a matter of understanding where the issues could be, building yourself enough time for that, giving yourself buffer room, and delivering at the end of the day a great product.
I was thinking, I remember I was reading through some examples. I'm like, this is the one, I think, transferable skill that probably needs the least, prior knowledge of the board game industry. I think actually somebody could literally be a project manager who's never played a board game in their life and knows absolutely nothing about the industry. Because for me, project management was, my previous life working for like a food company, for instance. We had project managers, and their job was basically to say, okay, you have all these people doing all this stuff, and you need one person to make sure that all that stuff is basically the timelines and everything line up. And if this person needs this person's stuff, okay, we'll make sure that their start time is set with that end time. And if that goes over, how's it going to impact over project? So they're constantly kind of with all these Gantt charts, kind of mapping things out. Not saying you have to get that advanced with project management on the board game industry. Certainly, I think it would help. But to me, it's like literally this is probably the one skill set that somebody could come in from another industry blind and still be quite effective.
I think so. Yeah. It's just a matter of hitting timelines. If you work project management, especially with something that's a physical product, that's one of the differences too. Like as opposed to video games or something else that's more of a digital product, because you have all the the manufacturing that goes into it and shipping and all the things that can go wrong in between there. And there's different bottlenecks and different things that can go wrong in that process versus something that's digital, which they have their own issues that they have to deal with as well. But yeah, if you've been able to do that, I think it's something that's very transferable. Whereas some other roles might be a little harder. Marketing, for example. It can apply in a lot of different ways, but if you don't understand how the board game industry works, how Kickstarter works, what people are looking for in a board game. If you just come in from the outside and just say, oh, I know all about marketing and sales, I can do this, no problem. Well, you're going to have a little bit of a learning curve. You're going to have to understand how the industry works as a whole and conventions, and how, it's not a, cutthroat technology kind of an atmosphere where everybody's, butting heads and competing and that type of thing. It's very collaborative, and publishers want to see other publishers do well generally, because we just want to get more people into gaming. That's the main thing.
I'd say social media is probably a good example of that, where there's a big difference between a social media manager for XYZ brand and a social media manager for this specific industry. It's very nuanced. It is very much based on networking and really knowing how to get to the right people. That is a skill set. If somebody has it in this industry, I think they could do very well getting kind of connected with the right game. You mentioned earlier about freelance. Would you say freelance is kind of the single kind of most common entry point to these various jobs?
I'd say so. It's much harder to get a job with a publisher, because what you have is you have a few like really, really big publishers. You got like Hasbro and like Spin Master and a couple others right at the top. And then you have, some medium publishers, and then a ton of really, really small publishers that are just, a couple people, maybe, one person, one man or one woman show, or a couple friends that, started up a company, that kind of thing. So they kind of do it all. They're not going to hire until they've gotten a little bit bigger and they realize, okay, we need more help. We're big enough now, we can afford to do this. And a lot of cases, it's who kind of thing. So a lot of these roles are just hired on freelance, and it makes sense in a lot of cases, because a small publisher is not going to go out and hire an artist and give them a full-time salary, because for every game that they have, it might be in a different style, and they don't necessarily have enough work to keep somebody employed full time all year round. Same thing goes with graphic designer, development work, that type of thing. It just depends how big they are. But yeah, a lot of them are going to be freelance roles. And even getting in with a company, quite often you will have been doing freelance, maybe with that company, with other companies, and build up your reputation. And then when something comes along, it's quite often who in the industry. So if you've, helped a publisher by reviewing rule books, or done playtesting with them, or done demos at conventions, done a little bit of development work, especially like for free or for very cheaply, and they know you and they know you work well with them, then, when they're looking for somebody in that kind of a role, you're going to be one of the first people to come to mind, because they're more likely to take on somebody who's a known quantity than take a risk with somebody else that they don't even know.
That's a good point. You talk in the book a little bit, I call it the rate ladder. But you have this kind of idea that if somebody's trying to get into the industry and you want to get your foot in the door, you're likely looking at offering your services for free. If you want to build a portfolio, you're probably looking at charging, a very low cost in order to build that portfolio up. And then, as you're saying, as your name gets out there and people start getting to know you and what you can do, that's when you get to the point where you can start charging what you're worth. And I think one of the examples you gave was Tristan Rawson from Lighthouse Games, I think was one of the examples where he had a very, very broad background in illustration. And then when he got into this industry, he did a lot of kind of jobs on spec and, working with people, working with his rates to kind of get his foot in the door and really kind of, get kind of his little chunk of the market. And now he's at a point where he's in high demand, right? So then you can kind of set your rates from there, I think. So, and I think that really applies to literally any role in this industry. Is that fair to say? Like you kind of do that ladder, free, then low, then charge what you're worth once you have that portfolio?
Yeah, it depends on the role specifically, but quite often that's how you're going to start is by doing something for free. Whether it's you're an artist and you've done some fan art, you've done a redo of a box, you've created a reference card, that type of thing. If you're a graphic designer or an artist, posting some things online and maybe somebody will discover you, that kind of thing, or going to some publishers and asking, showing them some of your work and asking for, to help them out, especially if it's a, project you're really interested in, and, maybe doing it at a lower rate. So quite often it is that doing it at a lower rate or doing some stuff for free for a company, and then you can start charging more. It's all about building up your portfolio, really, because you can't just go to somebody and say, oh, I want to charge, $50 an hour to do graphic design for you. Well, what have you done before? Well, maybe I've done something in other industries. Well, what have you done in board games? because there's different specifications and different needs, and people are looking for different things in board games, and you see some board game art is absolutely gorgeous. It's works of art, so they need to see that you can do things that are going to fit well with a game box and that type of thing, or art for cards and that type of thing. So you can do some small projects with people for very little money, or for free in some cases, just to get your foot in the door, get your reputation, get a portfolio, and then you can start to come to these publishers and say, hey, look at the stuff that I'm working on. I'd like to work with you too. And as you get more and more projects under your belt, your portfolio is getting bigger and bigger. You can start to increase your rates, and then you can start earning what you believe you're due. Because in any kind of creative field, you kind of have to prove yourself first, and one way to do that is to show that you can do the work, that you're a good person to work with, you deliver on time, and you have great results, and that will just make your portfolio better. Like the first few things you do, maybe you're not going to be the best, but as you're working on it more and more, you're going to understand what the actual needs are, and you're going to be able to fulfill some of those gaps.
How important are conventions, and what role do you see them playing in people kind of getting into this industry?
Conventions are pretty huge. I mean, that's where all the deals are made and people meet up face to face. I mean, you can cold pitch through email and do things virtually, but it's nothing like meeting somebody face to face, shaking a hand, playing a game with somebody, that type of thing. They're going to remember that face. They're going to remember your name. You can exchange a card. You can talk to them. Even whether it's doing something helpful for a publisher, like demoing games for them, helping them sell their games at a convention, meeting with them, pitching to them, showing them stuff you're working on. If you're a reviewer, asking for review copies of their game, that type of thing, to do reviews. Conventions are where people chat and meet and network, and this is a very, very social community. So you really have to get yourself out there, and for a lot of us, we're introverts and it's hard to do. So we have to find ways to break out of that shell. And, maybe it's a matter of, going with somebody else who's, doing something similar, or partnering with somebody, or, just approaching a small publisher, first of all, and kind of working your way up, or just finding something that's comfortable for you to do. But yeah, it's very much, conventions are a huge part of that for sure.
And certainly it's got to be tougher now with COVID,
Mm.
things being shut down and these conventions kind of going virtual. You don't have the same ability that you would have in the live conventions, where you literally just walk up to a table and strike up a conversation. On the online version of these conventions, you have to kind of schedule appointments and so forth. So, I'm eager to see this kind of come back, right? Because I think that
Mhm.
there's a lot of opportunity for people there. I know when I read this book, it really made me kind of understand that there's always stuff to learn. And although I'm a publisher, I've now done 3 games. I was still learning stuff reading through this book, right? So I'd say this book isn't just for people getting into the industry for the first time. If you're in the industry in any one of the disciplines, I think it's a great read just to kind of familiarize yourself with some of the other aspects, and you might be inspired and have some ideas. The conventions was a perfect example. I remember the last convention I worked. It was my brother and I were working the convention, and I was thinking in the back of my head, man, I wish I had some staff for this. Man, we can't really afford
Mhm.
staff, and I guess we're just going to have to work it, because I was used to conventions in the supplements industry, where my background is. Well, kind of looking at the way you describe in the book, I'm pretty sure next time I do a convention, I'll probably send an email to say, hey, is there anybody that's interested in working the convention with us? And by the way, we'll maybe pay your admission to get into the convention. There's probably going to be a couple people that volunteer just like get some experience in the board game industry. So, it's cool to kind of get that inspiration from different things. And I think this book is a great example of that. The other thing I noticed when I was reading through the book that really kind of sparked my thought process was the whole digital programmers job, right? And I think what's very clear by the time you're done reading this book is that you can take an industry which seems very small, and it is kind of small and niche, but you can slice that into a million slices, and each one of those slices can be a job, right? And where people can develop a very, very strong, solid skill set and be an expert at that slice. Digital programmer is one that I can see is a need for, that I know I've struggled with getting access to. So whether it be Tabletop Simulator, where most games now have to be demoed on Tabletop Simulator because of COVID, and Tabletop Simulator is not super hard to do yourself. But things like scripting and so forth is, it's kind of that next level of skill set that most people probably aren't interested in trying to teach themselves. So if there's someone out there that knows how to do scripting and simple basic programming, this is an industry that is screaming, that has just an immense demand for that skill set, right? There's no shortage of games where people need their game programmed and the cards automatically dealt out and the table already automatically set up. You're seeing more and more Kickstarters, people taking their actual video recording or screen recording of their tabletop simulator, moving around the box and using that as a cheap way of doing their animation. So all these things, if there's someone out there listening or watching, that if you have any kind of experience at all in programming, man, reach out to publishers and reach out to different game designers. Put your name on the different Facebook groups and the forums. I guarantee you're going to have people that they're going to reach out to you and say, "Hey, let's see if we can figure something out here." The biggest one for me that I still have not yet found somebody for, and if there's anybody listening and you know how to do this, reach out to me through the Binge, is Board Game Arena. So Board Game Arena is one of the largest digital platforms in the world for playing board games, and I think the reason why is it's very automated, right? So Tabletopia, Tabletop Simulator, very in the similar vein where you're still having to use your mouse to pick up pieces and roll the dice and move cards and so forth. Or Board Game Arena, you click a button, and everything's dealt, and then it'll give you here's your 3 options to choose from. You click the option, and it does all the stuff for you. And I think that's why it's attractive to so many people. You can play it on your phone and so forth. So if there's anybody out there who knows how to do programming in Board Game Arena, this is something that get your name out there, because again, there's a huge demand for that. For sure. What is your next, or data analysis actually, let me, one more thing. Data analysis is something I thought about when I was reading this book as well. I was looking at some Kickstarter data recently of my most recent campaign. And as I was looking through the data, I thought, you know what? If there's anybody out there who's good at data analysis, this would be another career that if they want to get into the board game industry and they're from another industry where maybe they're doing data analysis or statistical analysis and so forth for XYZ company and XYZ industry, that is an easily transferable skill coming over to this one, where there are so many Kickstarters that are run every single week. I'm sure that if you want to offer your analysis skills, there's some publishers and so forth out there that would probably be interested in at least listening to what you have to say. So,
James, that's so funny you say that, because I was a healthcare data analyst for 17 years before I joined here. So that's that was kind of my thing before I got into board games and game design.
Yeah, and the data is robust, right? So if you get lots of data through Kickstarter, if you use a pledge manager like CrowdOx, for example, or BackerKit, there's tons of data you can kind of mine through there as well. Social media data, once you run your campaign, there's just so much data to pour through. And that is not most people's forte, right? It's not. So I think it's something that if, like yourself, that where you've got that skill set, that could be your ticket in, right? So what's your, what are you working on now, Joe? I know you're a designer, you're a teacher, you teach game design, you run, playtest nights, you're writing book after book. What's kind of next on the docket for you? What are you kind of working on now?
Well, with this book wrapped up and out there now, back to working on the games as I always have lots going, and my game that we were talking about a little bit before, Relics of Rajavihara, right now that is being shipped. It's coming across over the ocean right now to my various fulfillment centers, and that's going to be delivered to everybody. And so in the meantime, I've been working on an expansion for it, which is going to introduce about 30 new levels. And I'm going to be launching that later on Kickstarter a little later this year. So that's in development right now.
Oh, that's cool. It looks like a super fun game, and it's got to be time intensive too. That game, like the amount of scenarios you gotta create, right? Like every time you do a new level, that's another new scenario you have to create. How do you find the time to do all this? Do you ever sleep, or what's the deal?
Well, luckily I do this full time. So I mean, when I was, designing part time and, working full time and family and everything, it can be quite intense. So you can only put so much time in, but, having more time is good. But still, I say, like, being a full time game designer, I'm surprised how little time I actually spend on game design, because there's all the other things that go into it, especially when you become a publisher and you're writing and everything too. But yeah, it's a really fun game to work on, but it is challenging because every level essentially being a different puzzle, one of the toughest things is making sure that there actually is a solution to every level. And I've definitely created some where I've sent it off to playtesters, and they've been like, I've been trying to figure this out for like an hour and I can't get through it. And I'm like, okay, let me go back to it and try it. And I'm like, oh geez, there is no solution. Like, and in some cases it's just a matter of, oh, when I took, a picture of the level that I had set up and transposed it into like Photoshop into a card, one block was out of place, and in a puzzle or something like that, just one little thing being slightly out of place can turn it from a good challenging puzzle to being impossible to solve, or making it so super easy that you can solve it in no time flat. So you have to be super careful, but that's why we play test, because I never want to put out any puzzles or any levels or any game that are unsolvable. So that's probably the biggest challenge with that.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I look forward to having you back for round 4, and all the best this coming year.
Oh, thanks so much, James. I really appreciate you having me on. Thanks again.
Cheers. This has been an episode of the Board Game Binge podcast, hosted by James Staley, produced by James Staley and Mike Bruner, with original music by Nick Smith. If you would like to watch these interviews live, simply join the Facebook group Board Game Binge, and you'll get access to live interviews, giveaways, and interesting board game content from across the industry. I can't wait for you to join us. See you next time.